me see if I can get our slides to share. So, all right. Sorry, technology is a wonderful thing. Let's go. All right. So can you guys see my slides now and me?
Yep.
Great. Alrighty. So as Dawn was saying, I am new to the department on faculty, but I did get both my graduate degrees here in the Department of Animal Science. So I've been in Laramie for 6 years now, I guess. So I finished my PhD last May, about a year ago, and I started this job just this summer. And I actually grew up in KC, Wyoming, so I'm a native to Wyoming, but and came back for graduate school. So I'm excited to get to talk to you guys because I was very active in, 4-H and FFA, and I wish I'd had kind of the opportunity to do some of this, take some of these classes. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about this. And as I go, I put my email on this first slide. If you guys have questions for me, if you think of things, or you have a genetics question that you've been dying to ask someone, please just feel free to email me anytime. I love to talk genetics with people. I like to talk livestock. So any questions you guys have, feel free to reach out to me at any point. But today we're going to talk about inheritability or heritability of traits. And so I'm going to do some probably review from things you guys have had in your biology classes and things like that, but then we'll get into really what heritability means in terms of livestock genetics and how we can use that in selection in our different systems. Okay, so first, and I know it might be kind of a pain to unmute yourself and chime in, but I always like to ask students first, why do you think we even care about genetics, right? So a lot of people they hear the word genetics and they either really like it or it's a little bit intimidating and they don't really want to think about that kind of stuff. So to you, what's important about understanding genetics in terms of livestock?
It just it depends upon, I guess, it's hard to say because it's like the way your structure, the genetics goes, the way your structure is going to go, which is the way your quality of your animals is, I guess, if that's the way I want to say it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really important. It's not something that you can really, we select animals all the time based on their phenotype, right? What we see. But in doing that, we're selecting a lot on the genetics of that animal, right? And I think it's something that, especially in today's age, we have a lot of tools and technologies available to us where we can utilize genetics to improve our herds even more so than we could 10, 15 years ago, just because of the technologies we have. So as an animal geneticist, my focus is how can we utilize animal genetics to improve our production herds? So this figure kind of like have flashbacks to that senior biology class, right? Where we talk about the basics here, and this is just looking at a cell, and then we have this compact, chromosomes, and if we start unraveling that, we can string out this piece of DNA here, right? And of course, you've all learned about your nucleotide base pairing and how those end up basically creating this helicase, right? Which is our DNA strand. But what we're going to focus on today is this important part right here, the gene, okay? And what the gene is, really, it's our functional unit of inheritance. So it's the part that we really focus on in terms of making different selection decisions and things like that we can pass on to progeny in our herds or our flocks to improve them. So this gene component is something that, a lot of researchers have spent a lot of years figuring out in these livestock species what sequence of DNA, so what A, T, C's, and G's compose genes that we're really interested in, okay? And I talked a little bit at the beginning that what we really do in livestock production is we're trying to select for a specific phenotype, okay? And all of these bulls here are vastly different in their phenotype, right? What we see. We have a big Brahman bull here, we have a Hereford, and then a Highlander. All of these are very different in their phenotype, and depending on where you are in the country, your type of feed, those kind of things, you're going to select a different phenotype that fits your environment, right? But the phenotype, it's not independent of itself, right? So a phenotype, we have this equation where we have P equals G times E. And what that is that our phenotype is affected by not only the genotype of the animal, or this G component, but also the environment, okay? So the E part of this equation. And I think it's really important that we consider both of these factors, the genotype and the environment, because both of them are going to influence that phenotype of the animal. So it's sort of like thinking, if you're a geneticist, right, you don't get to only think about the genetics of the animal. You have to think about the environment. You have to think about nutrition. You have to think about those things because they influence the phenotype. And then for a nutritionist, you can't just say, well, I know how to feed animals and I don't have to worry about the genetics, right? Because the genetics also play an important role in the phenotype that we see. So again, we just go back to this, is it all about the genes? And the answer is really no. Right? So the genotype provides the background for the phenotype, but the environment plays a really big role in that final phenotype. Okay, so these environmental effects can be external factors that influence an animal's performance. Okay, and I'm sure we're from the great state of Wyoming, and we understand that the environment can have a huge impact on our livestock production, especially in this time of the year and a little bit earlier, where we have these spring storms and winter storms. They're going to have an impact, of course, on the performance of our livestock. So with the environment, if we think about different factors, this top picture here, the reason I put it on is because if we think about Wyoming and the Mountain West, one of the big environmental factors that influences production in our livestock is elevation or altitude, right? So what is a concern that we have in higher elevation places that impact livestock performance?
Like brisket disease?
Absolutely, absolutely. So brisket disease, high altitude disease, that is something that we really pay attention to in our part of the world, right? Because we run cattle at really high elevations, and that can, if your animals aren't adapted to that, they don't have the genetic background for that, you can get some real issues with performance. Okay, so that's an environmental factor that we have to think about. And then these next two pictures, if you can believe it or not, obviously one is winter in Wyoming, which I bet you can guess which one. The other is winter in Florida. Okay, so the type of cattle we run also have to fit the environment that we live in, right? So some cattle, like our Indicus influence, the Brahman type animals, those guys are more heat tolerant. They're built for that. Their genetics enable them to be productive at warmer temperatures, right? So those cattle do great, but if you brought them to Wyoming in the middle of the winter, they might have a hard time, right? So the genetic basis, the breed basis of those animals needs to match with the environment. And then the last two pictures here, these dairy cows, they're out grazing in New Zealand, where, I mean, it is green 24/7, right? Round all 12 months of the year. But then over here we have a typical, range scene in Wyoming where we have a lot of sagebrush and things like that. And so another environmental factor that we have to consider that's going to impact our phenotype is nutrient availability, right? So, and I know these are all things that are pretty, intuitive to you to think about, but even in genetics, when we're trying to select for animals, we cannot ignore this environmental impact. Okay. So again, if we think about this phenotype by genotype interaction, this graph's a little crazy, but we'll walk through it. What I have here on your y-axis is your average wean weight per cow exposed, okay? And then here I have two different locations, okay? So we have Wyoming, and then we have, somewhere like Florida down here, okay? And in the circle, the orange circle, these are our Brahman influenced cattle, okay? So they are going to be our eared cattle. A lot of people talk about our Indicus influenced animals, okay? And then in the dotted with the box here are Angus Hereford crossed animals, okay? So if we think about it, in the Florida type part of this world, our Brahman cattle do very well, right? They perform well, they wean heavy calves, but if we brought them to Wyoming, they would not perform as well, right? Our environment is just really hard on them. They're not built for that. Now, Angus Hereford crosses, maybe they don't perform as well as the Brahmins in the South, right? Because they're maybe not as heat tolerant as a Brahmin, but they do okay. But then if we look at them in Wyoming, they don't really lose performance, even though we have a much more harsh environment in terms of cold, wind, and those type of things. And what the genotype by environment effect here is the difference between these two lines, between the solid line and the dashed line. This is saying that not only does the environment have an impact, right, but also the breed type. So that, again, is that genotype by environment impact that changes our phenotype. Okay, so I think that's something that as producers can be very frustrating from time to time, is that the environment can be really hard for us to control and maintain at a desirable, ideal temperature, ideal precipitation. That's just out of our hands, right? But unfortunately, to some degree, that has a huge impact on our phenotype. So we need to breed good genetics that fit that environment. So now the genotype, right? We talked about the phenotype, but what is a genotype? And this is something that I think it's, in its definition, it's pretty simple. So it's our combination of genes at a particular locus, okay? But what does that really mean, okay? And I have this little meme here. My PhD advisor gave this to me, and it always helped me remember the difference between a heterozygote and a homozygote, because they're just allele uneven, okay? So your alleles or your genes are different in a heterozygote. So if we take a look, let's take a schematic here. So here we have two homologous chromosomes, okay? And on these chromosomes, remember this is DNA along these, there is a locus, which is a location of a gene, okay? So locus kind of gives way to understanding that term. And then at each locus, there are genes or alleles, okay? So gene and allele are kind of a synonymous term here. And what we can see is that at each of these loci, okay, there's going to be in this case, two different types of alleles. There could be a big G or a little g, so a dominant allele or a recessive allele. Okay, some traits are going to have several alleles, maybe 4. Okay, but we're just going to talk about a location here that we just have the 2 different types of allele, a big G or a little g. Okay, and so if an animal is homozygous, okay, they have the same, that means they're going to carry both big G's. So a big G here on the red, and then a big G here where the blue is, okay? If an animal is heterozygote, of course, they'll carry a big G and then a little g over here, okay? And I'm going to try, if this works, to share my iPad so I can draw something for you guys here. And you'll have to excuse my drawing skills. They are a little to be desired here. Okay. So, can everyone see, hello, like a notebook looking thing from my iPad?
Yep.
All right, cool, it's working. So what I wanted to draw out here, and again, excuse the artistic abilities, but let's just say that these are our 2 chromosomes, okay? And we have this locus. And for this example, let's just call this the A locus, okay? At this location, on this chromosome, the animal can either have a big A allele or a little a allele. Over here, the same thing, okay? So depending on if the animal carries the big A and the big A, they could have this genotype, which is our homozygous dominant, okay? They could carry a big A and a little a, which would be our heterozygous genotype, or they could carry 2 little a's, which is our homozygous recessive, okay? And the reason that it is a recessive is because this little a allele is recessive to the big A allele, okay? So this big A dominates the little a. And kind of the best example I have to go over kind of the dominant and recessive genotypes are as if we think about hide color in Angus cattle, okay? So their hide color, we talk about the B locus, okay? And you can either have a big B allele or a little b, okay? So the 3 different genotypes are homozygous dominant, heterozygote, or homozygous recessive, okay? And so this is the genotype of the animal, okay? But the phenotype, in this case, we'll have black animals. The heterozygotes will also be black. But our homozygous recessive, that's how we get the reds, okay? So if you look out at a pasture of Angus cattle, if they're predominantly black and then you see some red calves or some red cows scattered about, it's most likely because you had black cows, but they were probably carrying one of these little B alleles, okay? So if you had a cow that was like that, and you had a black bull that also carried one of those recessive alleles, okay, you could end up with calves that carry 2 recessive alleles, giving you that red phenotype, okay? So again, the genotype is basically just describing which alleles do they carry at a specific gene, okay, or at a specific locus. So in this case, the genotype is homozygous recessive, okay? And this example I think is really nice because it also shows that dominant effect where this big B here overshadows this little b allele. So we get a black phenotype even though we have one recessive allele, right, which usually generates a red coat color, but because it's recessive to that dominant B allele, we get black animals. So I think we'll try to go back to PowerPoint slides now. Okay. So that's kind of some of the housekeeping things I just wanted to kind of go over before we went on, because I think it's important to understand these concepts before we get into heritability, because they really, are important in understanding how a trait is inherited and passed on. So the other thing we have to think about is what traits are most important, right? So this question is all very dependent on what species we're raising, depending on our production goals, right? So let's say you're a sheep producer and you raise Rambouillets. The goal of your flock is you're probably trying to influence and improve your wool characteristics, right? Because you're using a wool breed in your flock. If you were to raise Suffolk sheep, the goal probably isn't as much, or the emphasis isn't as much on those fleece traits, but rather more on growth and carcass traits, right? So it's really important in your production practices to define what traits are most important to you, whether it's traits that are, you really need to improve on because it'll help them respond better to the environment they're in, or if it's something to do with the market, right? So we know that the wool market's been pretty good lately, and so a lot of people are pushing some of those wool breeds into their breeding lines so that they can improve fleece quality. So a lot of this just depends on what your production goals are as to which traits you want to focus on. So we can break traits into 2, kind of general categories. We can have any observable or measurable characteristics of an animal. Okay, so this could be color markings, conformation, head shape, But then there's measurable traits as well, right? These are like our birth weight, our weaning weight, lactation yield, quarter mile time, right? So we're obviously talking about horses here. We're not so much in cattle anymore. But then we have staple length. And so our traits can be divided into these subcategories. And then we can also look at them in terms of if they're qualitative or categorical traits. So this is something like, is an animal polled or horned? Are they black or are they red? Other things are they bred or are they open? Are they carrying twins or a single? Okay, so our qualitative, or in this case, our categorical data, these traits are often really important to producers, and it's literally a one category or the other type situation. But then we have our quantitative traits, and these are traits that we measure in a continuous manner. Okay, so like birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, right? These are numerical values, and it's not just a yes, no category. Okay, so again, we have those categorical traits and our quantitative traits. And an operation does not just have a preference for categorical, or they only measure quantitative traits, right? We have to measure both of those. In most systems, we care a lot about multiple different types of traits. So the reason I bring up defining these different trait options is because when we get into talking about the heritability of traits, it's important to understand which traits are most important to you. Okay, so these next slides are going to have some of our basic definitions for heritability. And I can sure send these slides on to you guys if you want. I know I tend to go fast through slides and it's hard to keep up writing sometimes, so I can send them to Dawn and then she could send them out to you if that would help you guys. But when we're thinking about heritability, do any of you guys want to take a guess at what a definition for heritability might be?
The traits that you receive from like the parents?
Yeah, so that's that's the most common. So my junior and senior level college students, that is always their answer, and it is on the right track. It just, heritability goes beyond that a little, right? So what we have is that we have this, to what extent the differences we observe in performance are due to inheritance. So that's very similar to what you just said, Caitlin. But there's also a way to think about it in which you can ask, it's the degree to which the offspring resemble their parents in terms of performance for a trait. So this second one seems to be one that most people think of, right? So the heritability of trait is how much this cow and her calf look alike, right? And to some degree, that's right. But if we look at here, okay, these animals up top are two Black Angus cows. They look very, very similar, right? They look like the genes she had were passed on, right, pretty strongly to her calf. This dairy cow over here, because she is a Holstein, right, and then her calf is red and white, we might initially look at this and be like, ooh, heritability, not so great, right? But that's not necessarily true, because each trait of an animal, whether it is coat color, weaning weight, growth rate, it could be carcass traits, it could be back fat, it could be reproductive traits. Each trait has its own heritability. So heritability is specific to the performance of a single trait, okay? So you may have an animal that maybe in terms of growth rate and weaning weight and birth weight, right, the calf really resembled its mom's performance, right? It was very closely related. But then maybe in some other traits like fertility or things like that, maybe not as much. So the point here is that heritability is specific to a trait. It's not the heritability of an animal as a whole, but we talk about heritability on an individual trait basis. So when you're looking in a textbook or you look online for different heritability values, what you're going to see is a number that ranges from 0 to 1. Okay, sometimes they will put this as a percentage, so 0% to 100%, but most often you're going to see a heritability anywhere from 0 all the way up to 1. And what this means, and this is kind of a really important take-home point for you guys, is that if you have a heritability of 0, you interpret that as 0%, okay, so none of the variation that we see in that trait is due to genetics, okay? So what's impacting the phenotype then if it's not genetics?
Environment?
Very good. Very good. So these are the traits that are lowly heritable, right? And environment is playing a huge role. Whereas if we have a trait that has, let's say, a 0.7 heritability, that means that 70% of the variation in that trait is due to genetics, okay? So environment only has a 30% effect, okay? And again, you're probably never going to see 100%. Well, you're not going to see that, right? You're not going to see a trait that is 100% controlled by genetics, and it doesn't matter what the environment is, right? That environment is always going to play a role in the performance and the phenotype. So this definition I kind of boxed down here is one of our important definitions, or kind of our more accurate definitions of heritability. What we're really trying to do is look at the strength of the relationship between the performance, right, or our phenotype, and the breeding values, or the genetics, for a single trait in a population. Okay, so what we're really trying to say is how much of the variation in wean weight is due to that calf's genetics, and what proportion is due to environment, okay? And a lot of people have put a lot of work into discovering heritability values for different traits. And so we have kind of organized a bunch of traits that we're interested in into these categories of lowly heritable, moderately heritable, and then highly heritable. So I have some graphs here, and these are going to look a little crazy at first, but what they are is in our purple bar, okay, we have our breeding value, or the genetic component, okay, the genotype. In the red is our environmental impact, okay, and then the yellow is the phenotype. So in this example, we have a heritability of 0.8. So that means 80% of the variation in this trait can be explained by genetics, which is why we see in most of these cases, so each of these 10 numbers are 10 individuals, what we see is that our purple bar very strongly, right, is reflected in that phenotype, in that yellow bar. So what this is just saying is that in a highly heritable trait, our breeding value, or our genetics, have a very high impact, right, on what we see in the phenotype. But the environment has a much less, a much smaller impact on our phenotype. So then if we switch gears and we look at a lowly heritable trait, so this is a trait where we have a heritability of 0.1. So only 10% of the variance here is driven by genetics. So now we kind of see an opposite effect where our red bar is more in line with our yellow bar in terms of the environment impacting our phenotype. And our purple bar doesn't have as big of an influence on that phenotype that we see. Okay, so these are our lowly heritable traits that look more like this. And then, of course, if you had a trait that was right in the middle, so this is a heritability of 0.5, here we're saying 50% of the variation is due to genetics, 50% is due to the environment. So here you're going to see kind of a compromise, right? You're going to see an impact on your phenotype driven by both your breeding values in purple and your environmental factors in red, okay? So again, the point here is just that in our highly heritable traits, genetics are driving our phenotype, but in our lowly heritable traits, it is the environment that is driving that phenotype. So we, like I said, we can break these up into categories of highly heritable, moderately heritable, and lowly heritable. And these values are sort of the cutoffs that you'll see in textbooks, where a highly heritable trait is anything that has a heritability above 0.4. Okay, and that might seem kind of low, but given the fact that not many traits, or you're not going to see traits really above 0.8, that's why we set that threshold a little bit lower. So again, our highly heritable traits are oftentimes our product traits. So these are like our carcass traits, okay, our fleece traits. So our end product traits are generally highly heritable. And then we have moderately heritable traits, and here we have a range from 0.2 to 0.4, okay? These traits are our production traits, okay? So these are growth, weaning weight, yearling weight, birth weight, these kind of traits are generally categorized as moderately heritable. And then the lowly heritable traits are any traits with a heritability value less than 0.2, okay? And these often are our fertility and our survivability traits, okay, which makes some sense. If you think about survivability of an animal, of course the genetics are important, right? But the environment's going to play such a huge role in that survivability of that animal. So it makes sense that a lot of those traits are highly heritable because they're largely driven by an environmental impact. So what I did is I went through each, species, main species, livestock species, and tried to list out some of the traits that are highly, moderately, and lowly heritable. And these, again, you can find online, you can find them in textbooks. If you're ever curious about a trait and you want to know what the heritability is, just send me a quick email or give me a call, and I'd be happy to look up some heritability values for you. But these are some of our most common traits that we worry about in livestock production. So in cattle, for highly heritable traits, we see mature body weight, yearling weight, feed conversion, right? So the pound of feed required to get a pound of gain. Scrotal circumference is another one that's highly heritable, so largely driven by genetics. And then back fat thickness, okay? So leading into that product type traits. In sheep, we see yearling weight, then we see loin-eye area, and then we see a variety of fleece traits. So grease fleece weight, staple length, crimp. Okay, so all of these things, and then color, also the fleece, these are highly heritable traits, which means that we can put selection pressures on those traits and infer what their offspring are going to do, right? Because if a trait is highly heritable, the offspring of that individual are likely to reflect performance of their parents, okay? And then in terms of swine, we have loin-eye area and back fat thickness. So again, a lot of our product traits. Moderately heritable traits, I didn't put a lot on here, but there are a ton of traits that fall in this category here. In cattle, we have weaning weight, and then we have this trait called residual feed intake. And I don't know, it's kind of a newer, I guess, term for feed efficiency. And this is a trait that here at Wyoming, we've put a lot of work into researching the component of RFI that is genetic. And we basically have found that 40% of the variation, up to 40% of the variation in RFI can be driven by genetics. And so that gives us great hope in selecting animals that are more feed efficiency, because we know we can select on the genetics of that animal. And then if we look at sheep, we have birth weight, 60-day weaning weight, and then fleece grade. So this is one of the fleece traits that falls a little bit lower on that heritability scale. And then for our pigs, we have feed conversion and days to 230. These are some of the most common traits. They're defined as moderately heritable. Lastly, we have these lowly heritable traits. And like I mentioned, these are generally our reproductive or survivability type traits. So in cattle, we have calving interval is lowly heritable. So again, that's largely driven by environment. Sheep, we have number born alive, fertility, prolificacy, right? So how many lambs they will have, lamb survival, okay? And then on the pig side, we have litter size, both in terms of number born alive and number weaned. And then weaning weight in pigs is actually lowly heritable. And a problem, I guess, that we see with these lowly heritable traits is that we really care about these traits, right? These are really important to a producer. But unfortunately, so much of this is driven by environment, which are sometimes things we can't control. And so it can be really frustrating as a producer because we can't put as much of that selection pressure on these lowly heritable traits. But really what we have to do is manage those animals differently, provide different feed, do things in our management styles rather than selecting on the genetics. Okay, so that's kind of I by no means am saying that lowly heritable traits are ones we don't care about, because these ones are obviously ones that we really care about. It just makes it difficult, a little more difficult, for us to see genetic progress when a trait is not largely driven by genetics, but predominantly by environment. So these figures come out of the textbook that I use for my class. And like I said, I'll send you these slides so you can look at them. But you can get online and look at a list of traits by species, and they will list the heritability values for all the different traits of interest. So if you're really, I always talk about beef, cattle, and sheep because that's my background. But, if you're really interested in horses and you raise horses or chickens, there are all of these heritabilities out there for different traits, okay? And in general, if we look at this, again, we see that our calving interval is lowly heritable. Some of our growth traits are more moderate. And then our highly heritable traits are oftentimes things that are product-based, so back fat thickness, okay? And of course, in horses, we have lots to do with the performance in terms of speed and more of the athletic type traits. We have swine, poultry, and sheep here on the next page. Okay, so again, I am not by any means a poultry expert, but you can go in and look at these heritability values for these different traits. And what it tells you as a producer is if you're really trying to improve, let's talk back fat thickness in swine, right? So you're really trying to get that measure in check, trying to reduce that back fat because you've gotten way too much and you're trying to bring that down a little bit. 50% of the variation in that trait can be explained by genetics. So we can put selection pressure on that animal, right, on a sow or on a boar that has a favorable back fat thickness, and the likelihood that that is going to be passed on to the next generation are pretty high here, right? 50% of the variation is due to genetics. So it's important to know the heritability of traits, to know what kind of selection pressure you should or should not be putting on different traits. So this is kind of a good, a little table here. So this is data from sheep. But these two bullet points up here I think are really important and kind of like our take-homes here, that the higher the heritability of a trait, the better an animal's own performance predicts their breeding value, okay? And also predicts performance of the offspring, okay? But then the lower the heritability of a trait, the greater the influence the environment has on the performance, okay? So if we look at these traits, NLB is number of lambs born, okay? And here we only have 0.1. So only 10% of the variation in that trait is due to genetics. So here's one of those traits that really is the environment, right? But then if we look at the bottom where we have frame size, okay, so that's 0.6. 60% of the variation in frame size is due to genetics, which is why if we look at the industries as a whole in beef and sheep, over time, we've seen larger and larger animals, right? We've seen, if you look, if you ever get to UW and you go out to the wool lab, we have pictures lining the hallways from sheep from a long time ago, right? And cattle from a long time ago, and they're really, really short, right? They're small, stocky animals. Well, over time, we've been selecting for growth and things like that. Those traits are moderately to highly heritable. So we get progress really, really quickly, okay? So in not very long of a time, we've progressed from these really short, moderate framed animals to these really large framed, big animals, okay? And that happened really quickly because those traits are highly heritable. So when you put selection pressures on, we're going to see a response in the phenotype really quickly. So that's one of those things that can be a really good thing, but you also have to keep it in check that you don't get, a trait doesn't get kind of out of control in that respect. So I wanted to put this up here, and again, I'll send you these slides so you have them, because these come out of so the National Sheep Improvement Program puts out these heritabilities for sheep, and they update these from time to time. And again, you can see this general kind of categorization, I guess, of the heritability of traits. These reproductive traits, with the exception of scrotal circumference, are generally lowly heritable, right? So it's kind of unfortunate because we really care about those traits. So we know that we really have to focus on environmental influences here. Our growth traits are going to be more moderately heritable, but then we have carcass and fleece characteristics over here that are pretty highly heritable. So these are traits that we can apply some selection pressure to and see a quick genetic response, okay? Because so much of the variation is due to genetics, we can, have ewes and rams that are very good in these traits, and the likelihood that they're going to pass that on to their offspring are pretty high because those traits are highly heritable, okay? So this question I thought was kind of interesting. So if a trait is genetically determined, is it heritable? And the answer is not necessarily, right? And the example that I hear for this most often, and it's made the most sense to me, is if we think about the number of legs, okay, that a sheep should have, right? That is genetically determined, how many legs they have. But they should always have 4 legs, right? There's no real variation in that trait. So if there's no variation in a trait, there can't be any heritability to it, because heritability describes the variation, the difference in a trait, okay? Now, I put this over here because there are always weird exceptions. So this is a weird genetic mutation. This lamb, I can't remember if it's in Ireland or in Scotland, but it was born with a 5th leg right behind one of its front legs, and it did just fine. But this is a mutation. This is not a rule by any means. This is an exception to the rule. So even though the number of legs is genetically determined, it doesn't make it heritable, okay? Because we don't see variation in the number of legs. So if there isn't variation in a trait, then we can't have heritability for that trait. So this is for the number of legs. If we look here instead at the length, okay, this is something that is genetically determined, but also there's variation between animals in terms of the length of the leg, okay? So because there's variation from animal to animal, population to population, this trait will have a heritability component, okay? There's some sort of variation that is attributed to this genetics versus this genetics. That piece right there is the heritable component, okay? So that's kind of one of those weird things to think about, because we oftentimes just think every trait is heritable, right? But there are some traits, yes, they're genetically determined, but they don't necessarily have that heritability component. The other thing we have to be careful about is that if a trait is highly heritable, does that mean that they'll perform well in that trait? And I guess here, if we think about it, and I'm sure you've seen this out and about at some, at a show somewhere, or maybe at your family's ranch or your neighbor's ranch. Sometimes we had a cow, I know growing up, that she was just the nicest cow. She looked terrible, right? But she was a pet. And so we, always begged Dad that we could just keep her, please, because she was the sweetest thing. Well, she was terrible. She looked terrible. She had small calves. They didn't grow, right? So in those traits, like growth that are moderately heritable, or carcass traits, right? Even though those traits are highly heritable, That doesn't mean that it's necessarily good, right? What that cow was doing in our herd growing up, she was passing on terrible genetics, okay? So those traits were highly heritable, but she was passing those on. So her offspring continued to do poorly, and so on and so forth. So it's one of those things that just because a trait is highly heritable does not mean the animal's performing well in that trait, right? So if it's not, we want to be careful to select against that. Because it's highly heritable, we can quickly correct that trait because we can select against that trait and get away from the genetics that are driving that undesirable phenotype or performance, okay? So that's something that we have to, I guess, kind of keep in mind here. The other question is heritability the same everywhere we go? And the answer here is no, it's not fixed, okay? So in this instance, it's going to vary from population to population, right? So if we look at this top figure, where we have a Charolais and a low line bull, these breeds are built for different things, right? Just like these two breeds, we have a Beltex ram here, kind of funky looking, kind of like a pig, but it's a sheep. And then below it is a Merino, I believe, here. So our meat breed and our wool breed. These guys, too, the low line and the Charolais, they have very different goals in terms of their breed characteristics, right? So over time, these animals have, or the breed associations rather, have worked on animals for specific traits. We've recorded more and more data for traits of interest, like wool traits for the Merino, meat traits for the Beltex, and we've been able to change or improve the heritability for those given traits. So when I showed those slides earlier that had beef traits, sheep traits, that is a general estimate, but it's always specific to where those animals have come from. The other thing that drives, this, even if a trait is highly heritable, okay, if we aren't feeding that animal the way we're supposed to, or like if we look at these two pictures and we have this desert, looking country compared to this really nice lush grass, right? Even if a trait's highly heritable and we have the good genetics there, we still have to give them the environment to reach that genetic potential, okay? So that's another common misconception, I guess, is sometimes people get frustrated because they just spent a fortune on a powerhouse bull that has the best genetics, the best EPDs, and why aren't the calves doing phenomenal? Sometimes it's because those cows and the calves weren't given the resources they needed to actually reach the performance that they're capable of giving their genetics, okay? So it's one of those things that the variation can be due to that genetic component, but we still have to manage them properly. We still have to provide them with adequate nutrition and things of that nature. So the great thing about heritability is that we can change it to some degree, okay? There's things we can do in our management practices to help improve heritability of traits. So this goes back to that discussion of some of those lowly heritable traits like fertility and survivability. We really care about those traits. So just because they're lowly heritable, we don't want to just forget about them, right? We are going to have to do something to help improve the heritability. So the different things that we can do include environmental uniformity. So this is managing animals in a way that the environment affects performance similarly across different animals. So oftentimes if we, this can be something like feed quality, right? So we want to make sure our animals are all getting the required nutrients for their stage of production, and doing everything we can to minimize variation in environment that this herd or this bunch of cows face versus this bunch of cows, okay? Then we have accurate measurements. So one of the other big things with heritability, it relies on the performance measures, right, that we record as producers, that we report to breed associations, that we keep in our own records. And if we aren't accurately measuring things, then we can be affecting the heritability of traits, okay? So this even goes back to the days I remember weighing 4-H steers, and my mom would get so mad at us if we wouldn't clean off the chute before we weighed, right? Because manure would build up there, mud would build up there, and we were skewing our weights, right? And so that's something where we weren't accurately measuring our traits. We weren't reporting our performance traits the way we should. So that's something that we can do as a producer. And then we have these mathematical adjustments. And those are things that, like, when we wean calves, right, we wean on one day usually, maybe a couple days, but usually it's a common date. That does not mean that all calves are the same age at that date, right? Some calves are born earlier in the season, some a little later. So what we can do is adjust for that so that we give those calves who are maybe born a little later, give them the benefit of the doubt that they're younger than the others, and vice versa. So those are the mathematical adjustments that we can make to improve those heritabilities. And then this last one is what we call contemporary groups. And this is, if we think about it, the easiest way I think to think about it is, how do we manage heifers versus cows? Okay, we manage those two groups differently, right? We tend to put a little more care, a little more focus into those heifers, right? We're trying to help them get along, and they tend to need a little bit more attention than our cows. That, by managing those that way and making sure that you know, like your older cows, maybe you need to feed those old cows that have been in your herd for a long time. Maybe you have to improve the quality of their feed just because they're a little bit older. They need a little bit of help, right? So making sure that you have animals kind of grouped into physiological groups that make sense, right? So things that you're not going to bias. Well, you know, if you put heifers and cows together, or old cows and younger cows, of course your old girls might need a little more help, right? And that's okay, but we have to separate our animals into these contemporary groups so that when we record performance, that we're not comparing a 10-year-old cow's production to a 4-year-old cow's production. You know, that's kind of the idea there behind contemporary groups. So again, it's nice to know that there are things we can do in our management strategies, in our production practices, that can help maybe not always increase heritability, but at least make them more accurate, okay? And so if we think about how do we use heritability in livestock selection, so the whole point, right, is if we're going to have heritabilities, then we better use it for selection. So if we think back, remember that heritability indicates the extent to which differences in animals are determined by heritable factors, so our genetic factors, as opposed to environmental effects. Okay, so it's that difference there. Whereas, if we think about that, producers tend to select for our more highly heritable traits because they know they can make a significant change in terms of genetics, and they choose to not change our lowly heritable traits through genetics, but rather through changing their management strategies. So again, this kind of goes back to our traits like fertility, number of lambs born alive, right up here. These are traits that are lowly heritable. So we're not going to expect to put genetic selection pressure on that and see a big change. But what we can do is change management. We can do different things with feeding strategies. We can, you know, try to make sure that there's, lambing barn for our first time lambers or things like that, where we can improve performance of those lowly heritable traits through our management practices. But then we look down here, so this is a shearing crew, our fleece traits, they're very highly heritable. We can select on that trait's performance and expect those offspring of these animals to perform similarly because those traits are highly heritable. So it's something that whether a trait is high or lowly heritable, we can still select on it. It's just a matter of what kind of selection pressures we want to put on that trait. So again, it's my last slide. Why do we care? Why do we care about heritability? Why do we care about inheritance? And it's because it allows us to make selection and management decisions, right? If we don't understand how traits are passed on, how much the environment plays a role in different traits, it's really hard for us to make decisions when we decide to keep or cull animals, when we decide, our rations that we're going to use for our heifers versus our cows. All of that really depends, and I think is driven by not just heritability of traits, but the genetic component of traits that we care about. So that's my last slide. If you guys have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And of course, I will send these slides on so you guys can have them for, if you're interested in knowing some of these heritabilities. But if you guys have questions, I'm happy to take any.
This is your time. You guys can unmute yourself. Does anybody have questions for Hannah?
Nope, I think that covered a lot of my questions and basically the whole thing. So that was very good. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And feel free, Caitlin, if you ever have questions or if you think of something random. I have students all the time asking me, hey, do you know the heritability of this trait or whatever? Just feel free to email me, because I always have a fun time actually looking into traits that maybe I don't think about all the time. So feel free to do that.